Welcome to our conversation on defending democracy in the digital age. I'm Sherry George with the League of Women Voters of Alaska, and joining with the League of Women Voters of Maine, the Leagues of Alaska and Colorado have collaborated to offer over 20 seminars over the last 2.5 years, covering topics like discriminatory effects of AI and algorithms, trends turning into reality, the Silicon Valley tech coup, defending democracy in the digital age, and most recently, Ann Applebaum, who covered a wide range of topics facing our country and the world, and the part technology has played. Today, we are so happy to have Courtney Radsch join us and dive into AI, journalism, and democracy. Dr. Radsch is director of the Center for Journalism and Liberty at the Open Markets Institute, where she produces and oversees cutting-edge research into the political economy of AI, news media market structures, and information power, and helps design smart policy solutions that protect democracy and human liberty. Previously, she was a fellow at UCLA's Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy, where her research focused on media sustainability and the platformization of journalism, AI governance and information ecosystems, and the evolving socioeconomic and technopolitical effects of media and technology. As a global thought leader, she regularly publishes and provides commentary and analysis in top media outlets, keynotes, and moderates events around the world, and advises publishers and media leaders. She has testified before congressional, parliamentary, and competition authorities in several countries and advised international organizations. We want your questions and concerns to be answered, so throughout our time together, please enter your questions into the Q&A feature. It's a Q&A feature rather than chat, please. So now, Courtney, we're turning it over to you. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this really important topic. And in addition to, that background, I would just add that I have been a journalist for the past 20 years, got my start at the New York Times, worked in the Middle East before I got kicked out of the country for an article I wrote, and worked for many years at the Committee to Protect Journalists. So really on the front lines of a lot of these issues. And I did my doctoral work in Egypt in the years leading up to what became known as the Arab Spring, and seeing just how empowering these young people who were able to use these technologies to imagine a different future and bring about political change. How far we have come. Now, we know that tech is ubiquitous in our daily lives, from how we communicate to how we find information to how we shop. It's in all of our things increasingly that we have in our houses. And we often talk about technology as neutral tools. But I want to suggest that the problem is not tech. It is the corporate monopolies and the profits that they generate, which allow them to spend vast sums of money lobbying, translating their economic power into political power, whose profits they are now reaping as we see the fusion of state and corporate technological power in the second Trump administration. This is not only to the detriment of our democracy here at home, to journalism, but also to people around the world. Couple this with the rapid advancements in artificial intelligence, which is being driven by a handful of tech monopolies and China's own AI industry. But I'm going to focus mainly on the US, in part because we're essentially playing the game that China set out for us, which is this idea of innovation at all costs, although it's very unclear to what end we are innovating towards. So I want to propose that these rapid advancements in AI, coupled with the existing power and data dominance of a few corporate tech giants, amplified by their increasing alignment with governmental interests and problematic ideologies, actually pose some of the most significant threats to democracy that we have seen in recent history. And they are undermining the viability of journalism, which is a core institution of democracy, as well as fundamental human rights like freedom of expression, freedom of thought, privacy. This has put us on a trajectory towards digital authoritarianism and techno-fascism, but I'm going to suggest some things that we can do at the end of my talk. So don't worry, it won't be completely too challenging here. So I want to talk about the evolution of this technology, how we arrived at this precarious point, particularly with respect to journalism, the mechanisms of control and manipulation, and the profound impact on journalism and truth as we dive into the ideological underpinnings and the way that AI works to consider what steps we can take to safeguard our future. So if we think about the evolution of technology power from platforms, this real platformization of life over the past 2 decades, as these platforms have become indispensable intermediaries for communication, for commerce, for information access, and it has fundamentally reshaped industries. Chief among them is journalism. And we know that journalism is really important not only to democracy, but it is correlated with good governance, with less corruption. And over the past 2 decades, as the digital economy has advanced, we went from journalism using these platforms to these platforms using journalism. And we've seen the economic, the political, the infrastructural logic of tech platforms deeply penetrating into our information ecosystems, with the result of undermining editorial independence and the viability of a variety of business models. So, as we've seen over the past 2 decades, that news production has been severed from news distribution and monetization, we have seen the profits and the power of these platforms accrue to give them outsized revenue from and influence over journalism and many other parts of our system. So Google, Meta, and Amazon now absorb more than half of all ad money. This economic disruption is not due to the failure of news organizations to somehow adapt, because we know that both Google's search and Google's ad tech have been declared to have been illegal monopolies, that they were coercive. Meta is currently on trial similarly for having a monopoly in social networking. So this is not a problem of their own making. This is not a world where digital subscriptions can close the gap. This is a precarious financial situation for news media, and suggesting that we should somehow find other business models out there is unrealistic, and it risks putting journalism behind paywalls and turning quality information into a luxury good. So, given that, one of the things we found out in the trial, for example, against Google, was that 20 cents of every dollar that publishers spend advertising on Google is attributable to pure monopoly rent. Google exploits its search monopoly to compel publishers to accept the terms of use for products outside of its search market, like accelerated mobile pages or now generative AI summaries. So Google's monopolization of search and its duopoly control with Facebook, now Meta, of the $200 billion digital advertising market not only diverted revenue directly from newsrooms, but it also compelled newsrooms to use their platforms to reach audiences and advertisers. Even as the initial symbiotic relationship that may have existed at the outset of the internet age, traffic in return for visibility, turned into a parasitic one, especially now with generative AI, which is once again built on the backs of journalists and publishers without permission, compensation, or credit. So both of these platforms, their growth and their value was propelled in part by the presence of journalism and fact checking, as well as through their dominance in ad tech. I mean, Google search would not have been useful if there wasn't journalism on it, right? You don't want to do a search for you're, say, a new parent, what sort of baby formula should you feed your child, and not get the latest report about a recall or, challenges in the supply chain. So similarly, we see that a lot of the interactions on these platforms show just how valuable news is, because there have been behavioral tests to show how people act differently on these platforms without news. So we also know that these platforms have created a dependency because of their intermediation in the relationship between audiences, between advertisers, and because of their data logic. Their control over revenue forces journalists in the news industry to adapt a platform logic that is driven by datification, engagement, profit maximization, not by public interest issues like accuracy or newsworthiness. So publishers must contend and adapt to platform policy, design, and algorithms to optimize engagement and monetization, which influences their editorial choices. And we can see this power of gatekeeping, manipulation, and control when we search for information, or when we see how algorithms determine the visibility, viability, and independence of journalism and other forms of information. So, we've heard about playing to the algorithm. Well, now I'm hearing from journalists about how they're playing to AI. What's going to show up well in a generative AI search? What is AI going to pull from that thing that you wrote in order to spit it out? Algorithms determine what news content users see, giving them the power to amplify or suppress specific news sources or types of content. So I was speaking with a Ukrainian channel during the invasion, by the way, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where it lost more than 500,000 followers after reporting on abuses by the Russian army because Facebook deleted it. We know that, many of these platforms demote and delete images of the Israel war in Gaza. Every journalist that I've spoken to in the Middle East has pointed to the overmoderation and censorship of Palestinian news outlets, of Arabic terms that are very common in their language, but simply because they're in Arabic. And I think most dangerously, as we're seeing now, we see the political capture and manipulation on these platforms. X, for example, which, we have to stop saying that it is the free speech wing of the free speech party, or somehow attributing a free speech ethos to Elon Musk, because X has suspended accounts of journalists reporting on Musk's activities. During the US elections and in their aftermath, Instagram concealed search results for hashtags related to Democrats, while, along with Facebook, they amplified posts from Trump and Vance. X similarly manipulated visibility during the recent elections in Germany, where its algorithms were shown to disproportionately amplify extremist parties, and where X deplatformed a journalist who had published a vetting document on J.D. Vance when he was a Republican running mate. So there's lots of manipulation happening in all different sorts for all different reasons. The business models of big tech are fundamentally at odds with democracy. What is the business model? It's based on data, engagement, and profit, what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism. So their coercive dominance means that they set the terms for the wider economy, turning surveillance capitalism into the guiding logic of the entire digital economy. They operate on a business model that is driven by datification. What do I mean by that? I mean that they translate our expression, our behaviors, our bodies, our sentiments into digital data. And they're based on engagement. And what fuels engagement? We know that fear, extremism, fuel engagement, gets you to stay on the platform longer, maximize their profits. And we know from their own research inside these companies, for example, Facebook amplifies misinformation, hate speech, violent content, and was determined to be somewhat responsible for the genocide in Myanmar by the UN. Real world violence resulting from the manipulation of their platforms and the way that their algorithms amplify problematic and dangerous content. This vast collection and processing of data also allows the inference and even the manipulation of our inner states, our intentions, our proclivities. We can see this, for example, in the addiction by design. One of the revelations of whistleblowers from Meta is that former executives saw features like the like button and infinite scroll as deliberately designed to maximize engagement through dopamine-driven feedback loops. Whistleblowers have revealed how the unauthorized harvesting of user data is used for psychological profiling and targeted political manipulation dating back now almost a decade. And yet we still don't have a national data privacy law. We still don't have state level privacy laws, and we are still open to this psychological profiling and political manipulation, which is worsening now with the development and integration of AI throughout these platforms. And of course, we know, Instagram, for example, the use of that platform worsens body images and mental health problems for teenage girls. There's all sorts of problems that we know about already with these platforms that are now at the forefront of AI development. There is an enormous concentration of power in the digital ecosystem among a handful of American firms, and their dominance gives them enormous control over the essential building blocks for the most advanced AI systems: data, computational power, talent, and it gives them a lot of control over and an ability to force us to use those products, to integrate them into word processing, into email, into text, into generative AI, all these chatbots that are now out there. So these, we don't have a lot of choices, for example, in what browsers we use, right? Two companies dominate the browser field. It's being integrated in there. Same with email, same with word processing. So they're able to push out these AI systems, which then forces us to use it, which means that we are then further propelling the datification and value being created in those systems. This also is not only detrimental to us, but also it creates a potentially insurmountable advantage for these incumbents, leading to data monopolies that further entrench their dominance and means that we don't get any other option. We don't have any alternative to surveillance capitalism, to the system that they're designing. So as they extract value and render industries like journalism, like the arts, entertainment, increasingly perilous, they are extracting immense value from each of us and from our collective uses of their platforms. For example, Google search monopoly. When did we decide that the value that the information and data created through our use of search belongs solely to Google? That's actually jointly created value, right? Us using their platform to search helps their platform become better at giving us search results. So we could decide to govern some platform data like that, where we're jointly creating value in a different way than just saying, hey, big tech, you get to keep all of the value created. Similarly, they are using humanity's expressive content without consent, credit, or compensation to enhance the value of their platforms and their artificial intelligence systems, and that now to create market replacements for journalism, for art, for music. The explicit use of copyright protected works like books and music has been acknowledged by these companies and who have said we could not build these products without using journalism, books, everyone's social media content. Well, they've just decided to turn breaking the law into a competitive advantage. One of the things I really like about the New York Times lawsuit against OpenAI for copyright infringement is that it asks not only for the damages, which are pretty limited given that it's only based on the actual use of specific copyright content, But it also asks for algorithmic disengorgement, or basically this idea that it's not only that you have this ill-gotten data, but you then created algorithms and AI systems built on that ill-gotten data. So those should also be dismantled or turn them into public goods, for example. So journalism and creative industries are now having to compete with the very, outputs that are created by the theft of their intellectual property. It is something where we have to have public policy come in and right the imbalances of the market and force these companies to abide by existing laws. I also want to talk a little bit about AI because there's two ways that AI is really dependent on journalism. So first, journalism makes up a pretty significant, if small, amount of foundation models. So you hear about biased models and biased data. Large language and multimodal models, or what are termed foundation or frontier models, are trained on vast troves of data that are scraped from the internet and other digital repositories. So it is always going to be biased. It's going to reflect the historical and structural exclusions, the digital divides, who got published, who didn't, what information gets datafied, and of course, the norms of the most avid internet users. So we have to be very careful about accepting large amounts of web text as representative of all of humanity. That risks perpetuating not only dominant viewpoints and reifying inequality, but also about shaving off the unusual, unconventional, and outliers, because AI systems are predictive systems. They are not intelligent. They are not thoughtful. They are just predicting what is most likely to come next based on all of this datification. Now, think about the fact that Russia's budget for RT and the Internet Research Agency tops $1 billion. That they have spent more than a decade flooding social media, flooding the web with influence operations, with propaganda, with their, freely their news produced and sent out there for, the world's journalists who are losing money to use. When I was recently in Ethiopia, I saw, RT on giant screens at the airport. They are among the most read and viewed accounts in many languages like Arabic and Spanish, above many news organizations. Well, now all of that information is being incorporated into the underlying models of our AI systems. They are embedded, reinforced, and reproduced in the outputs. We saw a study from NewsGuard, for example, that tested several AI chatbots and found that they regurgitated Russian propaganda. So we also saw, for example, that DeepSeek, the Chinese large language model, refused to give out any information about Tiananmen Square. So we have to realize that these AI systems are inherently ideological and incorporate, the data on which they are built incorporates an ideology. So then you have what's called RAG, retrieval augmented generation. So when you use a chatbot or a search, generative search product, for example, and you want more up-to-date information, right? Search is not very useful if you don't get results from recent history. You might remember when you first tried ChatGPT that it couldn't return results from before 2021. Well, now they use you can think of foundation models as kind of like the more static model, and then they go out and use RAG to go get more relevant or timely information from around the web or within a certain training corpus. Well, a lot of that is from news organizations, right? So Perplexity AI, for example, went out and within minutes of Forbes publishing really important investigative report, Perplexity AI had regenerated a version of that story, created a podcast out of it, and created a video version of it, all of which detracted from the original reporting, diverted traffic, diverted the much lower revenue that such traffic generates, and just got to kind of do that without any sort of credit or payment to Forbes, which did the 3-month investigation. So this is not sustainable. Furthermore, there is a tsunami of synthetic content online. I'm sure you've all seen your own social media feeds filled with AI junk, random things that you're like, what is this? This can't possibly be true. And I don't even know, and I don't have the time to figure it out. Furthermore, we need access. We need journalism to survive and continue to exist because AI models that are trained on other AI generated content can degrade over time or even collapse. These generative AI models need access to quality, accurate, factual content in order to mitigate against what the industry likes to call hallucination, but what we should actually just be calling errors. These are predictive errors. These are falsehoods creating facts from thin air. So there are many reasons why we need journalism. And we need that because AI is being integrated throughout our information system. It's eroding the shared factual basis necessary for a functioning democracy and public deliberation as all this, junk and fake content takes over. And it makes it harder and harder for journalism or other human professions to break through and reach people, not to mention to monetize. So I want to just conclude by talking about a couple of options for public policy of how to resist some of the merger of Silicon Valley's power with state authority that is resulting in unprecedented access to citizen, taxpayer, business, and organization data, to these regulatory vacuums that are being filled by corporate interests that challenge democratic governance. Because democracies typically accept a level of inefficiency in order to have privacy, in order to protect individuals and mitigate the power of the state. But Musk and Doge are seeking to undo all of this. And we already know that Musk has integrated AI into government systems and is using proprietary government data to train what appears to be his own AI systems. This is very dangerous. And we need to figure out how to reclaim our sovereignty over our information system, over this unchecked concentration of power, and over the trajectory of AI development, which threatens not just journalism, not just privacy and competition, but human agency, democracy, and the ability to think freely and form independent judgments. So first off, we need to break up the tech monopolies. Actually, we're seeing that the Department of Justice is pursuing this with Google in court right now, hopefully as well as with Meta, breaking up Instagram and WhatsApp. We need to prohibit bundling, prohibit self-preferencing, impose interoperability requirements, impose non-discrimination. We need to dismantle data monopolies and think about how to govern data that is generated by public activity and think of it as a public resource. We need to require transparency of the data inputs into AI models, not just so that we can exert copyright, but also so that we can see how safe they are. What is the information that they're trained on? And mandate radical transparency about how algorithms function, what data they use, and their objectives. And we need to strengthen regulation and enforcement of existing laws. We have antitrust laws on the books. We have copyright and licensing and some privacy laws on the books. We also have things like must carry and common carriage requirements. We should be governing search and these core information infrastructures like, some AI processes as common carriage, kind of public utility style regulation. And we need to protect creators, protect journalism, and support the development of alternative technologies. Because if we're going to protect core fundamental constitutional freedoms, human rights, and democracy, we need collective action at multiple levels, but we really need public policy to support our efforts within the industry and as individuals. Thanks.
Hey, this is Ann Luther. I'm gonna jump in here on the questions. We had a couple people, including John Greenman, put their hand up while you were talking with a question. John, if I allow you to talk, would you like to pose your question? Come off mute, John, and put it out there. John is not coming off mute. Oh, here comes John. Go ahead, John. Hello, John, you're off mute. Say a few words. Okay, that seems not to be working. Does anybody else want to put their hand up to ask a question live? Okay, we've got a couple questions in the chat. The first one is, Courtney, can you tell us a little bit more about Facebook deleting reports of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and about Gaza?
Yeah, sure. So I did a bunch of research during the Russian invasion, and then I did a big report called Understanding and Responding to Global Emerging News Threats, or Urgent, a couple of years ago, where I interviewed and surveyed journalists in developing economies around the world, so more than 300. And what I heard from them is that when there are times of crisis, you see the content moderation policies of the platforms aligning with American foreign policy interests. And so when we saw in the face-off between Russia and US tech firms is that the tech firms essentially had to acquiesce to requests by the EU and to kind of the US foreign policy that, saw this as a very before obviously this administration tried to revise history. We saw, for example, Meta announced that they would prevent Russian state media from advertising on their platform and would demonetize their accounts. Twitter adopted some restrictions on state-affiliated accounts, also restricted advertising and recommendations of those accounts. And as a result of trying to impose restrictions on Russian media content, they also affected independent Russian media as well as some Ukrainian media. And so, as I mentioned, there are Canal 5, for example, saw a huge drop in traffic. The same thing happened in Myanmar when the coup happened there. So there were several media organizations that operate online. They have mainly Facebook pages and YouTube channels, and they saw that when the military junta retook power, all of a sudden their traffic dropped and their ability to monetize dropped just when the world needs, more independent information about what's happening on the ground. And that is seems to be a response to putting on, restrictions, geographic restriction, linguistic restrictions. Similarly, in terms of, you asked about Gaza. I mean, we've seen this for many years. It's well documented, especially if you look at, for example, during the rise of ISIS in the mid 2010s. A lot of Syrian media content was also affected in the effort to stave the propagation of ISIS-related content. It ended up getting huge swaths of content related to Syria generally. So I think more than 140,000 YouTube videos, for example, were removed during that time, but from independent media. So, and in terms of the amplification of GOP candidates, it wasn't per se GOP. Well, I guess it was at that point they were candidates. That is just what the data shows. So one of the reasons that it's so important to have data transparency and access is so that you can do this type of research and be able to tell, for example, by plugging into an API.
Amplification of GOP candidates. Wow. Is Blue Sky really better or different?
So Blue Sky is a decentralized platform where you have more control over your feeds and various different types of algorithmic curation options. So, if you think about how social media first started, it was chronological. So there was minimal algorithmic curation. It was chronological, or for example, on Facebook, it was based on what your people you followed, friends you followed, posted. But, over time that shifted, particularly as these companies bought up digital advertising and created digital advertising capabilities and became data companies. And so then they wanted to maximize the time we spent on platforms. And they discovered that, by manipulating and algorithmically curating based on, a variety of factors, that you could then increase engagement. And so Blue Sky, has a lot of different ways of curating, and they don't force you to adopt one form of algorithmic curation, and they don't control the curation, and they don't sell advertising. So there's an entirely different set of economic incentives
How
embedded
do
in
they
that.
make money?
I'm not entirely sure that they are making money right now. A lot of the platforms, a lot of the tech firms first try to get a lot of users, right? You can see that across the economy, whether it's, Facebook, Twitter, but also Uber, Airbnb, right? They all started by like, get a bunch of users and then figure out how to make money.
So we get a couple questions here about the money. Like, how do we sort of separate making money off data and like if you change the financial equation, you can we want news organizations to make money. Public media is great, but the New York Times, we want them to make money. Like, how do we get the money out of it? And our state efforts to prevent selling data really effective in that?
Yes. So first of all, absolutely, we need data privacy laws, and we need that to apply, kind of at the individual level. So we need to have more control over our data. You can see that, for example, in California, which has a state law, and in the EU's GDPR, Global or General Data Protection Regulation. That can help because, and we saw that, for example, in the fact that these companies did not roll out generative chatbots and search in the same way in Europe because they were enabling access to private protected data. So we definitely need data protections. But like I said, we also need to think about other forms of data because it's not just private data. It's also the jointly created data through the use of their platforms, and then all of the proprietary data that they have from the businesses that use their platform. So for example, Amazon, it uses data from what's doing well on its platform to then go create Amazon Basics, versions that undersell those competitors. We saw from some of the court documents and whistleblower documents in Meta that it was doing a similar thing, looking at, what's doing really well on its platform, what can it do to compete. So putting up barriers between different, vertical constraints on what type of businesses these different platforms can own at the same time, and governing some of them as common carriers or akin to common carriers, which would prohibit them from self-preferencing or discriminating against certain categories of users. It would prevent them, for example, the telecoms are not, they're monopolies, they're private companies, but they are not allowed to listen in on your phone calls, to deny you access to using, making a phone call if you're a terrorist or, on the wrong side of the political divide. They're not allowed to capture all of your metadata and then sell that, package that up and sell that to people who want to target you. So, similarly, we have imposed this on our communication platforms for a long time. Our cable system, for example, is required to carry local broadcasters because we said, you know what, there is value in having local information available on these new technology platforms. So in Ohio right now, there is a case where they have essentially said, we want to treat Google search as a common carrier. I think that holds a lot of promise for dominant monopolistic platforms that play an infrastructural role in our economy and in our information systems. So if you treat search as a common carrier, then you can impose certain obligations on it. Similarly, the Department of Justice is in court this week pursuing in the remedies trial for the illegal search monopoly case against Google. And one of the things that it has proposed is turning Google's search index into essentially a kind of public good or something that other companies could interoperate and use to run their own services. And it has suggested that Google should not be able to use the data it generates from search and from its other products to use it in its AI systems, because that's just going to further cement their dominance in that sector. And we learned from the Microsoft case, a couple decades ago, which was the last big antitrust case against a tech firm, that the goal of these cases is not just to rectify past harms, but also to prevent future monopolization. So there are a lot of tools that we have. And I would add one more thing. You've probably heard about Google's test in California to remove news in retaliation and retribution for the potential passage of it's called the Journalism Competition Preservation Act. This idea that there's joint value created by journalism being on these platforms, and the platform should return more value to journalism. So it requires negotiation and essentially platforms to pay for the news they use. So Google definitely did not want this, and they threatened to censor news in California. They did a test in the EU where they banned news. We saw Meta banned news in Australia before it adopted its news media bargaining code. And Meta is banning all news on its platforms in Canada in retaliation for a law they passed. They're doing the same. If you impose a must carry obligation on platforms like Facebook, like search, then you couldn't just decide, you know what? I hold myself open to all comers, but I'm just going to discriminate against news publishers because I don't want to comply with this law. We can't just, for example, decide, you know what? I don't want people in wheelchairs to use, I don't want to have to build a ramp for people in wheelchairs. So I'm just not going to serve them. There are many existing principles and must carry and common carriage and anti-discrimination where we need to use these and apply these to these fundamental core infrastructures of the modern, digital economy and digital democracy.
Okay, so wait a minute. How did those bans on journalism in California and elsewhere, how did that work out?
So we don't know about California because they wouldn't provide any data or information. In the EU, they did this test, and then they did their own homework and did their own data analysis, again with no transparency, and said that it had very little impact. But actually, when other experts looked at the impact, they said that's not true, especially because we have several behavioral studies from Switzerland, from Poland, from the UK and elsewhere showing that there is value in journalism. And if you think about how to divide that value, then you can say, okay, well, maybe it's 50-50 or 40-30. And so basically, actually, a colleague of mine did a study here in the US and said, okay, well, based on this idea of people behave differently on, when they have news, and this is how much advertising revenue they make, Google and Facebook would owe over $1 billion to news publishers each year. They don't want that legislation. So they keep trying to essentially tell news organizations, you're not going to be able to use the platform. So now in Canada, news organizations are essentially censored. So if you try to post a link to a news article, it will not link out, and you'll get this interstitial that says it inaccurately says it's because the government has banned news. But what you see instead is people are using screenshots of news, right? So there's still value, but because Canada doesn't have a must carry provision for its platforms the way it does for its broadcasters, Facebook can just decide to do that.
Wow. I got one more question, and then I want you to look at Jane Hatterer's question, which is a little bit more on the upside. But how concerned are you about the monetization of data that Doge has stolen from the federal government?
I'm deeply concerned about that, and I'm surprised that we don't see more business leaders up in arms about that, as well as, more individuals. So, like I said, you know, we accept this level of inefficiency in government because we don't think that, IRS records and the Department of Homeland Security should talk to each other too much, or we don't, think that our health data should be available to the education department or sold to insurers, for example. And so we should all be very deeply concerned. Furthermore, if you think about all of these systems, it's not just American data, it's also business proprietary data. The fact that you have all of these contracts now, information about bids, information about how much things cost, how much was paid for, now in the hands of the wealthiest person in the world who has at least 6 lines of businesses, several of which are monopolies, should be deeply concerning to everyone. And there's no way, I don't think, to really claw back that data.
Mm. All right. Well, Jane's question has to do with maybe what is the promise of generative AI, and is there a way for it to actually help consumers become better informed? And there are a few questions in here that have to do with digital literacy. And is there work apart from federal policy and state policy, is there work that we can do to make the users of these technologies better?
Yeah, so I think first understanding, as I just alluded to very briefly, like what is AI and how does it work? So v- avoid anthropomorphizing AI, right? Let's be clear. This is a lot of data, some really high-powered machines and some really complex math. These are predictions. So what happens if we're building these systems that are based on predictions? That is my concern, right? So, I see this question about, how we can use it for ideation, research, and design. Maybe if you're already a critical thinker, that could be helpful, but I would always say do that after you've done your own initial thinking. Because what we're worried about is this dependency, that we will develop this dependency on AI. We know that AI is sycophantic, so it wants to please you. How do we think about that? I'm really concerned, honestly, about journalists and news organizations once again going full force to integrate these products into their systems, again, doing partnerships with, Microsoft-backed OpenAI and Google to integrate these systems into the newsroom because it will create, again, this dependency. And we are kind of this idea that we can personalize the news for everyone. Have we stopped to think about what the impact of taking mass personalization on a whole nother level to everyone is, and what that's going to do to our ability to have shared reality, shared facts, communication? So I really worry about that. And I worry a lot about the dependency that this is creating, as well as the labor displacement. And I know that a lot of people say, like, it's not going anywhere. Yes, they're improving in accuracy. Sure, but right now, the system that we're building is inherently extractive. There are no limits right now on what data can be taken to train these machines. And so there is this impetus to collect more and more and more data. Remember that one of Elon Musk's companies is neurotech, and Meta also. They have brain computer interfaces where they are literally implanting chips into our brains to read our thoughts. What comes after reading thoughts? Manipulating thoughts. We have no protections against this. Yes, there may be some beneficial medical applications, but that is not how this is being governed. This is not how this is being developed. So I think there's a role for AI literacy. We cannot expect people to determine what is generative AI content and what is not. That's just not going to be something that is realistic or expected. And I think that we have to be very careful about, I mean, personally, as a journalist, I would never use generative AI content. But, I think there could be interesting ways to incorporate it into certain processes, translation, transcription, but you have to look at it as basically like an intern or a, very junior research assistant. And I'm worried that as we force feed AI into education, into our jobs, especially in the absence of privacy laws and in this mass surveillance, I wrote a piece I'll share in the chat. We are building the same system that China has, right? The social credit system where we are looking at behavior, how we interact online, all of this. The only difference between the system that we're building here and the mass surveillance system in China is a tiny, tenuous hold in which most of the data here is governed by private corporations, and over there it's much more accessed and controlled by the state. But now in this regime, that very thin line is being broken down. So I think we have to be very careful in how we, further incorporate these technologies and get rid of this idea that it's inevitable.
So making a big assumption here that maybe the hope for federal policy enactment in the next little while is not that great. What can state legislatures do? It sounds like California is trying, but they're getting quite a bit of technology pushback. What would you advocate for us to do in our state legislatures, if anything?
So I think if we see enough states pursue a common agenda, then that can compel action at the federal level. But I agree with you. We are not in an era right now where there's any interest in reigning in power, with the exception of maybe content moderation on tech platforms, right? So I think at the state level, definitely privacy legislation. And I would encourage you to look at Danielle Citron's book on intimate privacy, because we need to expand what we mean by privacy, not only our personal data, but also our intimate data. So, how we are interacting in public spaces, for example, in intimate moments, or upskirting, these sort of things, as well as biometric and neural data. We need protections over that. And it can't just be like these silly consent pop-ups that we get, right, to comply with privacy legislation. That is not a real mechanism of consent. Second, at the state level, they can, again, look at their existing laws around how to govern core infrastructure. And they should apply this to search, dominant social media platforms, streaming platforms. So, for example, Netflix and Spotify, they should probably have a must carry for news as well. We need to, update our regulatory approach to address these core platforms. Similarly, Amazon Marketplace. So you have that authority at the state level. I think state AGs, attorney generals, should be bringing more cases against these platforms for anti-competitive monopolistic behavior. Unfortunately, at the state level, it's really not possible to enforce copyright law. And so that's going to have to, I think, wait for the federal level. But I think those would be kind of some initial things that we could do in order to, well, I would add one more thing, which is impose data transparency requirements. And so that would improve safety. So it's a safety issue. And then it would also enable potentially down the road the ability to trace copyright. So couple that with data access requirements for researchers and journalists. That can be done at the state level. And if ideally, the states can kind of look to each other and try to harmonize a bit as Europe has. And that would at least give us, some autonomy over what's happening, some, pushback in the absence of concerted, effort at the state level. I mean, at the
Which
federal
state?
level.
So if you're talking about taking model legislation from one state and trying to replicate it across a bunch of states, would you direct us to any particular state that is really leading on this?
I think so. California with its privacy legislation, I think there's legislation at the federal level, like the American Innovation and Choice Act, and some of these other efforts to prevent, this monopolization that could be adapted to the state level. And I would look at Ohio, right? Even though that case is being litigated, it hasn't been decided yet. And again, there is a long historical precedent of governing core infrastructural and monopolistic platforms, as well as, things like, traditionally inns, railroads have been governed as common carriers. So we still have those tools, and states should resurrect them.
We had a lot of other questions in the Q&A. I don't know if you've been scanning through those, Courtney, if you see one that you'd like to answer before we try to wrap up here.
I think that there is a tension between, and kind of seeing in some of these questions, there is this constraint between, we have to use the technologies. We can't just opt out, right? No one should have to go live in the woods as a hermit in order to not have their fundamental rights and privacy violated. So we have to figure out, how do we use these? How do we ensure that our students and our workforce are able to use the latest technologies in a way that is empowering and respectful of human rights and human dignity? So there's the tension, right? Is how to do that when we are in such a coercive system. So I think, they need to have a deep understanding of these technologies that we're using. And I would say look for alternatives that are not developed by big tech corporations. Look for open source, for, nonprofit or B corporation, right? A corporation that has a public good endeavor that is not required by law to be focused solely on shareholder value or profit maximization, right? Think about those things as you're deciding which technologies to integrate. Look for open source, look for interoperable, look for decentralized options. And actually, as I've been studying the search thing, there are a lot of search engines out there that I had never even heard of. Why? Because Google has a monopoly, but like they have whole different value propositions. And so I'm kind of in the process of experimenting with some of them. And I've been a long time DuckDuckGo user because of the privacy proposition that they don't follow you, they don't monetize your data. So we need to encourage more of that sort of, product in our choices and where we shop, where we search for information, and what platforms we use to communicate to the extent that we can.
Yep. Sherry, let me turn it back over to you to wrap us up this evening.
All right. Well, thank you, Anne, for jumping in and handling the questions. There were so many good ones. And Courtney, you can see we could have gone on for hours with all your fascinating information. It was wonderful. So thank you for joining us tonight, the participants, all of you, and to Courtney for taking time from her research, her analysis, her commentary and writing to cover with us the wide range of issues facing not only journalists, journalism, publishers, privacy, and our public interest. A recording of today's conversation will be posted to the League of Women Voters of Maine's website soon under advocacy and then digital democracy. The recordings of earlier speakers are also posted there. So please watch seminars you may have missed and share this resource widely amongst the members or other people in your web of friends and relatives. If you happen to miss Ann Applebaum's live event and would like to watch it, please contact Ann Luther, who you just saw, with the League of Women Voters of Maine for access to Ann Applebaum's presentation to us. If you'd like to keep this series going, please consider a small donation to our tip jar on the League of Women Voter of Maine's website, and note digital democracy and the how should this donation be used box. We're working on our May gathering. Watch for details and let others know when we post that information. Thank you all again for joining us, and to Courtney and the Leagues of Maine Alaska and Colorado today. So bye for now and keep up the fight.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.